several months, and Rushdie has also been an interlocutor in this discussion, so thank you to Rushdie as well. These discussions were not talking about safe spaces was the most unsafe conversation we had in this whole conference. Just to say, it was very interesting. John Packer has the challenge, the unenviable task of summarizing the entire day in the next 15 minutes. And I'd like to take a second to introduce him and invite him to come to the front. John has recently taken up responsibilities as Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. He's well known as a practitioner of human rights as well as a thoughtful academic in the area. You can read the bio, I won't repeat it. But I do want to say that one of the first conversations I had with anybody about this conference was actually with John when we were talking about what was happening on the political activities front, what was happening with the CRA, what was happening with civil society in Canada. And we had an extremely lively conversation that got a lot of us thinking, and certainly me thinking, about how to position this. So thank you for your inspiration and your thoughtfulness around this, and I'll invite John to come up and give some closing remarks. And as I said, after that, we'll have a short break, and then we're going to move into the public evening session, which I hope you'll all join us for. And then afterwards, we get to drink. So.
Thanks very much, Pearl. You guys can stay if you want. Not going to be long. I've been listening and thinking quite a bit today, but I've also been a little bit tired and preoccupied. And this session maybe was very good because it ended in this discussion of safe spaces. And I just came back yesterday from South Sudan, Juba, South Sudan, and safety has a different, and space have different connotations. And amongst the conversations I had with people trying to organize a national dialogue, we had a consultation in the safe place of a specific retreat near Cape Town for a week, hosted by the government of South Africa. Then we went to Juba, and during that, one of our participants, two of his nephews were murdered. So, the conversation about safety, space, let me just suggest to you that from my professional experience, working in a lot of places, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, so forth, I would only plead for you not to suggest that this is a zero-sum game, that this is that the path towards inclusion is by subtraction, it is by addition, both physically and in use of technology and so forth, and that one should be very, very cautious to argue that people have been overheard. The idea is to create the opportunity for genuine exchange that is respectful and other things that we can talk about. But as Amartya Sen has argued, the need for capacitization of those who might be marginalized or disempowered to be empowered. But that is not about disempowering necessarily others. That's my one reflection by the end of that discussion, because I'm a little bit worried about that, the direction of that discussion. Others should leave in order to make space is problematical. Thank you, Madam Co-Chairs and colleagues, for allowing me a few moments to reflect on the day. Let me just say I've written a few pages. I'll just go through them quickly. It's an honor for me to be invited to give these remarks after a full day on something I think should be the highest priority of any democratic society, how we live together and how we approach that. But I must admit that I'm a novice in this conversation in this country, having lived and worked most of my professional life, almost all my career abroad. So to comment, I'm commenting from less of an internal Canadian experience over the last 30 years, more from abroad. And to avoid further audacity in this, I'm not going to attempt really a summary, if you don't mind, of today. Rather, allow me a few remarks from a distance of someone who's worked for a long time for human rights, peace, and justice abroad, while always relying upon and benefiting from those at home. I took for granted I came from a society that is largely democratic, free, and so forth, or at least so I thought. From a personal perspective, however, I've long been, some of you may know, I've long been associated with a small but well-known American establishment, largely Canadian, run NGO known as Human Rights Internet, which was some years ago, out of the blue, after 40 years of enjoying charitable status, suddenly subjected to a CRA assessment following an allegation of political activity, an allegation from the government in breach of charitable status. Specifically, the matter of concern was the delivery of educational training on human rights-based conflict analysis and prevention, including mediation, offered by myself, for staff of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a 57-member intergovernmental organization to which Canada has a formal intergovernmental relationship, including a special envoy, and of which the Canadian government occasionally funded some of the very work that was now considered political activity. It seems, I don't know, but it seems that the sole basis for CRA's concern and eventual decision to revoke HRI's charitable status and to impose a penalty of surrendering 100% of assets was the simple correlation of the word Islamic with HRI's publicly available annual report of activities. Not Islamic activities, but that we did something with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That seems to be the sole basis of the revocation. Following substantial costs, as well as considerable generated fear, which has resulted in a still existing chilling effect on the current board, HRI chose not to expend further time and money or to take greater risk to contest the unsubstantiated and non-meritorious but damaging determination. The result is that an excellent organization, small organization, run almost entirely on the goodwill and non-remunerated efforts of concerned citizens, came near to closing, and its reach and effects have been compromised. That's the result. This all due to the actions of a small unit in one branch of the Government of Canada, which as a whole purports to uphold the fundamental values of democracy, respect for human rights, the rule of law, both at home and abroad. How ridiculous. I share this story mainly to convey my own shock that this happened in my own country. While I was spending time, my professional life, promoting responsible authority, democratic governance, and robust civil society around the world, usually in so-called conflict-affected and transitional societies. In my work, Canada was, or had been, a shining example. That's not me saying it. Almost everybody told me that. Oh, Canada. A reference point of good and democratic government. Notions we have the temerity to include in our national slogan and trumpeted commitment to peace, order, and good government, and which we assert in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unfortunately, my eyes were open to what this meant for any society, for our society, our fragile nature, the importance of vigilance, the nature of the institutional framework which is essential to realize and maintain a genuinely free, democratic, rules-law society. I didn't think we had to fight that fight again. I thought that was fought long ago. Let me add that it is on this basis of dedication to this goal that my colleague, Viviana Fernandez, and I, on behalf of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, are immediately pleased to join the initiative for this conference and to support it. Indeed, we believe that a vibrant civil society is a hallmark of a free and democratic society and sine qua non for its full functioning, for maintenance of the rule of law, for good and effective governance, which contributes to the realization of full lives and dignity and freedom and rights for all human beings, and for sustainable peace and development of society as a whole and for the world. So with regard to today's conference, permit me just to share a few observations. First, I consider it poetic that the first panel began with remarks by Mary Edwards, who I think has left, unfortunately, whom I never met before, and whom amongst her many accomplishments, of course, is co-founder of the Women's Legal Education Action Fund, or LEAF. There is no doubt, and there should be no doubt for any Canadian, that Canada is significantly a better country, a better space because of LEAF. Thank you, Mary, and thank you for all those who have done so much and continue to do so much to fight for better policies, better laws, better programs and practices, in short, for better governance and better politics. This morning, Mary pointed out that in a democratic society, government should be making it possible, not limiting, making it possible for interested and affected persons and groups to express and to advance their concerns and positions, to advocate for change. For me, this is the basic value and instrumental to the realization of other values and goals, including peace and prosperity. In other words, not only should a robust civil society be protected from undue constraints, but it should be proactively facilitated and to create the conditions necessary for the very society we purport to be pursuing and to uphold. Of course, effective civil society does not replace government in general, nor to replace specific public authority, but it is instrumental for a high quality of governance, which is able to know and to understand the genuinely held and evolving will of the people, both in its range of views and with regard to specific issues. In other words, beyond periodic elections. And to design policy, to elaborate law, and to implement it on the basis of the widest possible voluntary compliance, as should be the case for any democracy, and even for responsible authorities seeking good, if not wholly democratic, government. You want to cultivate voluntary compliance. You do that by serving the public interest. The crucial element of such a system of governance is evidence-based policy and decision-making that is not arbitrary and that reflects and serves public interests rather than serving particular or private interests. This is apparent in an era where more and more governments simply don't want to know and don't want others to know, and moreover, are willing to act to quell those who dare to question or to dissent or to oppose. That's the era we're in now. They don't want to know. Let me add that the evidence invoked this morning from Freedom House regarding declining democracy the last 10 or 11 years is only an ex post facto observation and confirms what we know from history and for which we have elaborated norms and standards to address, both to protect and to facilitate eternal vigilance. But this realization is coming late, as many countries, even self-described now as illiberal democracies, assert a new politics of what one German commentator has dubbed orderism, where security trumps human rights and simplistic majoritarianism trumps democratic principles, minority rights, and fundamental human rights, and has ushered in a period of securitization of civil spaces and activities purportedly for our own good. For our own good. I'm sorry to say that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, our own compatriot and my former colleague, Michael Ignatieff, infamously wrote in the New York Times that we can no longer afford to be nice with human rights in the face of such challenges to our security. And so we stepped on that slippery slope. This logic is self-defeating. What kinds of democracies actively constrain freedoms and repress? And what kind of perversion is it where we fear freedom and happily consent or demur in the face of spurious assertions that it is in our interest to be less free? Clear, I'm no libertarian, but driven by fear, we seem to have been duped into accepting what is not in our interest, neither alone nor together. Related to these questions is a basic matter of paradigm. Who is the state in a democratic society? Whose space and resources and powers? And what is the legitimacy, if for a moment we concede the legality, of some government of the day usurping the resources, the public purse and powers, to constrain or withhold our freedoms and to stop making it possible, as Mary asserted, for the expression of views differing from those of that momentary government? Surely the aim of better governance requires the full range of existing views, of varying needs, interests, and aspirations, genuinely and peacefully expressed, to be heard and considered, including both critiques and proposals. Broad deliberation will permit innovations to become manifest, for mistakes to be avoided, and thereby to result in better lives for all. This implies a paradigm not of civil society versus government, but of both categories of society, along with private actors, to engage together, varyingly, consciously, thoughtfully, and honestly in the construction of overall or collective well-being. It requires reconciling public and private interests, and their often overlapping manifestations. In this respect, while not mentioned during the day, conceptions of the new economy and a growing so-called third sector, we didn't discuss it today, but I'd like to just raise it, of participation and wealth creation are increasingly recognized and essential. So economists now increasingly speak of first, second, and third sectors, private, public, and the so-called voluntary, which is a growing sector, non-renewable. For this, we need to reimagine the economy in terms of a future of more leisure, uncertain distribution of wealth, prevailing insecurity, and increasingly complex interrelations. Imagining this in terms of a binary relationship between public and private interests is neither realistic nor good. Civil society and community-based organizations are essential and likely to be increasingly so. This is not necessarily in competition with the other categories, but rather complementary. I believe it is in this spirit that my colleague Ravi Malhotra this morning asserted that we should not fear the opportunities of globalization and technology. Indeed, that social movements can benefit and have benefited greatly from these, on the condition that we have the right regulatory framework, which of course is the vital condition and the nub of our concerns. But this is not a new insight. Optimism seemed to be present in some of the later morning presentations, where we saw examples of progressive innovations such as What Works Centres in the UK or Winnipeg's Boldness Project, demonstrating bottom-up approaches which have been generated with few resources yet significant effect and reach. I realized that we also saw the sobering challenge of moving from where we are, prevailing shortcomings, lots of problems, to where we can and want to be, and the gap is great. But it is observable, and so we can imagine it. And indeed, we know that a number of countries have advanced towards this. Indeed, we, Canada, are lagging, but we can learn from others. While after lunch, the third panel was more than sobering, perhaps overwhelming. Again, we appeared to know the problems, and the use of technology may help us to organize as citizens and to continue the old struggle for freedom and for good government. This may be the impetus for us to contest prevailing assumptions, policies, and laws. I just take a moment to advertise on the website of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, University of Ottawa. You'll find published a new edition of the Canadian Yearbook of Human Rights. It's a kind of recreated document or a book, which has a special section co-edited by Kent Roach and Claire Forzese on security and human rights. I invite you to read it. One participant asked, shouldn't political expression and activity be protected by our charter as a legitimate and even charitable activity, if, as others qualified it, at least for public interest and benefits and not partisan activity? Again, what kind of democracy do we have where citizens are afraid to express or organize themselves or subjected to substantially unequal positions, notably material ones, based on the uncertain whims or preferences of the government of the day? We were again reminded that these questions and many others have been considered in depth by other countries and its useful conclusions, which Canada may refer to. In addressing safe spaces, I'm almost at the end, both physical and virtual, our conference explored how we can imagine and construct a new and different politics which is sensitive, even comfortable, and thoughtful. Despite the obvious countervailing challenges of reductionist social media with pervasive discomfort and defensiveness, which feature defensiveness. In this regard, the role of the Academy is an undoubted position for learning and to cultivate a culture of respect, inclusion, equity, and collaboration. This implies a positive disposition to engage, even if critically, rather than to exclude. Safe in this sense is not about being tepid or even correct, nor of winning anything, but rather of an approach, what I would call dialogic and deliberative ways of living together. This raises related questions about general education, culture, and a rich notion of democratic society for which we haven't had the time to delve, but which implications and reach are important. I fear, however, that the mainstream outside this room is very far behind this conversation, with resorts to intimidation and violence becoming more common, and that lay at the other extreme of what we would hope. And the tendency seems in that direction. I'm worried in that direction. I think this all tells us that we must return to and work for the well-known basic principles and to repeat and rebuild and repeat and rebuild and continue to do so. To end at the beginning, inspired by Mary's proposition, let me underline that we can and should make it possible for Canada to create the conditions for a better society, where people can share and pursue their views without fear and on a relatively equal basis for the overall public interest and in the Commonwealth. Today, we are ahead of where we were generations ago, so we should not be so lamenting. And I believe we have also today taken a positive step in this direction, at least to better understand, analyze, commit further steps. Thank you to the organizers, to the sponsors and participants for creating this opportunity. We look forward, I believe, as the organizing group to eventual conference report and to continuing the conversation with a view sooner than later to realizing the possibilities we know exist. Thank you very much.